Everyone, and welcome to the second week of virtual classes. This week we're going to be focusing on the movement from climate justice theory to practice, as well as thinking about some of the ways that these theories can be applied and the critiques of applying them in actual public policy. To get us started with this discussion, we're going to be looking at Posner and Sunstein's article that critiques climate justice theory and argues for the separation of concerns of justice from responses to climate change. So in addition to describing and analyzing their argument, we're also going to be evaluating what role justice should play in responding to climate change. So they use their article with a thought experiment, and they say, imagine that India faces a severe new threat, some kind, say an asteroid collision. Imagine that the threat will not materialize for a century, and imagine that the threat could be eliminated, but India lacks the resources and it's a purely practical manner to do so by itself without bearing enormous costs to the well-being of their people. Now, if the world came together, Posner and Sunstein suggest in this thought experiment, they could fight off this threat and eliminate the threat of the asteroid in some manner. And if they start acting now, it would be cheaper than in the long run. Furthermore, others argue in this thought experiment there is a strong moral obligation of the wealthier countries to help a country many of whose population still lives in poverty. And so let's imagine that this is a persuasive argument. And they all agree that they should work together to fight the asteroid. So think to yourself for a second, do wealthy countries of the world have a moral obligation to spend billions of dollars to protect India from the asteroid? Sunstein's and Posner's argument that it might seem intuitive to think that the United States should accept the proposal for a larger fund simply because it is wealthy. If resources should be distributed from the rich to the poor, on the ground redistribution would increase overall welfare, promote fairness. That intuition appears sound. But there's an immediate problem. If redistribution from rich nations to poor nations is generally desirable, it's not at all clear that it should take the particular form of a deal in which the United States joins an agreement that is not in its interests. They imagined that what if there wasn't actually an asteroid, but since all the wealthy countries had agreed that in principle they should help out India in fighting the asteroid, what if they just gave us all the money they would have spent on asteroid so they can improve their economy, their medical system, and make lots of people's lives better? We can only imagine that the wealthy countries of Western Europe and North America would probably say no. So again, if Posner and Sunstein argue that if wealthy people and wealthy nations want to help poor people and poor nations, doesn't make sense that wealthy nations should bear greater emissions reductions efforts, bear greater mitigation burdens in order to achieve this redistribution of wealth. Their puzzle then, for Posner and Sunstein, is why distributive justice is taken to require wealthy nations to help poor ones in the context of climate change, when wealthy nations are not being asked to help poor ones in areas in which the argument for help is significantly stronger. Now we're going to bracket for a question the fact that many people do argue, many of the global justice literature that we've talked about throughout this course, that does argue that wealthy nations are being asked to help poor ones in areas where the argument to help is significantly stronger. But let's just accept the premise here that, like, why would we expect wealthy nations to bear greater mitigation burdens if they're not being expected to bear greater redistributive justice burdens? And their argument is worth taking seriously because they're starting from a series of premises that take both climate change and distributive global justice seriously. They argue that the world taken as a whole would benefit from an agreement to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. They argue that they acknowledge that some nations, above all the United States and China, might not benefit on net from an agreement that would be optimal from the world's point of view. So they acknowledge that there are serious distributive questions. And they do generally believe that there would be that wealthy countries should give to poor ones. And they discuss they get to this argument through a discussion of a Pareto optimal climate treaty. If you're unfamiliar with the idea of Pareto efficiency, it's the idea that at least one party is better off and no party is worse off. And so they argue on page 1569, if the US were to be a net loser in a climate treaty, as a matter of actual practice, the standard resolution of the problem is clear. The world should enter into an optimal agreement, and the United States should be given side payments in return for its participation. But they reject this international Paretism. We agree in many domains, resources should be redistributed from rich nations to rich people, to poor nations and poor people. So they do take these distributive justice questions seriously. However, they argue that three problems emerge. That significant greenhouse gas reductions are a crude and somewhat puzzling way of attempting to receive redistributive goals, and they develop three arguments. First, why should redistribution take the form of an in-kind benefit when a general grant of money to poor nations could use as they wish? Second, why should rich nations help poor nations in the future rather than poor nations now? Third, if redistribution is the goal, why should it take the form of actions by rich nations that would hurt many poor people in those nations and benefit many rich people in rich nations? So we'll look at these in more detail. This first question is similar to some of the discussions that we've had in the discussions of global justice, but like why and they acknowledge that climate change will hurt the poor worst, but they argue that rather than redistributing the costs by having the United States and Western Europe bear greater mitigation costs, that we should just take what we would spend on mitigation and give direct cash transfers to poor nations. And that way, poor nations could spend the money on whatever they wish, such as education, AIDS prevention, or healthcare in general. They can do what they view as to be more efficient and more optimal for their second argument. They also make this argument that should be familiar from us about like the distinction between present and future. We can think of this in terms of social discounting rates. But the benefits of climate change mitigation would primarily be for future generations, right? Where the aggressive action to mitigate carbon emissions now isn't going to change or eliminate the amount of climate change that we're seeing in the status quo. It's going to hopefully prevent worse climate change down the future. But like, why shouldn't so there's a kind of moral spin on social discounting that rather than spending money to alleviate harm in the future, why don't we spend that money through direct cash transfers to alleviate suffering in the present? And I think that there's at least some moral claim here. Their third argument is pretty interesting, and they're arguing that countries are internally diverse. That that we can't just talk about countries as being wealthy or poor, because there are internal divisions and there's significant amounts of economic and social inequality within countries. While India is relatively poor, there are many wealthy people there, and while the US is relatively wealthy, there are many poor people in the US. And emissions reductions efforts to limit the amount of greenhouse gases being pumped into the atmosphere would increase energy costs, would increase food production costs, would increase many costs of basic supplies that risk hurting the global poor. Climate change might help some. Climate change itself, not response to climate change, might also help some of the global poor. Many people die from cold, they write, on 1587, and to the extent that warming reduces cold, it will save lives. Warming will also produce monetary benefits in many places, such as Russia, due to increase in agricultural productivity. Many millions of poor people in such countries may benefit from climate change. This is this part isn't the most persuasive argument, but there is a kind of question of like, if we treat countries as kind of rich or poor in isolation, what happens when we try to make these redistribution? So in total, they conclude, they raise this kind of question that what is puzzling is the claim that on distributive justice grounds, the best approach is for the United States to try to assist poor people in poor nations through a climate change agreement, rather than take more direct steps to those who need it. And so instead they argue that we should separate these questions, that we should separate distributive justice and global wealth redistribution from climate change and universal greenhouse gas mitigation. And so you might be thinking to yourself, hasn't the United States and other wealthy countries emitted the greatest total amounts of greenhouse gases? Shouldn't they be held accountable for that? However, just like the climate change, there's problems with distributive justice. Posner and Sunstein argue that there is a significant, challenges for corrective justice, and this is going to rehearse some of the arguments that we discussed with Jameson and Senate Armstrong last week. They argue that the climate change problem fits poorly with the corrective justice model because the consequence of tort-like thinking would be to force many people who have not acted wrongly to provide a remedy to many people who have not been victimized. And so we can think through all of the questions of assigning kind of individual liability to those responsible and adopting a more corrective justice model. And first, who is the perpetrator? Again, states are not individuals. Some people in the US are taking important steps to lower their own greenhouse gas emissions, and it seems unfair to punish them by holding the US to a higher standard. Many of the emitters are dead. We've already kind of discussed some of these arguments. And historical emissions have benefited the globe. The massive increase in economic productivity has lifted millions of people out of poverty. That's while inequality has increased, absolute levels of poverty have decreased over the last half century. But there's also a question in terms of who are the victims. We have the kind of non-identity problem that we've encountered before. How are we supposed to make this claim about who is going to exist in 2050, 2100, based on emission decisions in 1950? And furthermore, they also argue that current emissions benefit people in the future by amassing capital on which they can draw on to reduce poverty and illness and to protect against a range of social ills. That if we impoverish countries now by forcing them to make stark emissions reductions, then they're going to have less economic and social capital to respond to the worst effects of climate change later in this century. And so so there's a question about victimhood here that Posner and Sunstein are raising, that the emissions reduction targets might actually intensify this victimhood. They also raise questions of causality, and these are very similar to the arguments that Jameson and Senate Armstrong are making, right? That emissions do not cause harm in the same way as drunk driving or being negligent in workplace safety regulations. That these are not either intentional harms or these are not negligence in following that. And there's problems of culpability here. No one intends harm. Ignorance is not the same as negligence, and many people have no choice. There are significant socioeconomic constraints that limit our ability to have complete control over our emissions profiles. So, Posner and Sunstein ultimately conclude that if the United States agrees to participate in a climate change agreement on terms that are not in the nation's interests, but that would help the world as a whole, there would be no reason to object, certainly if such participation is more helpful to poor nations than conventional foreign aid alternatives. So they're not saying that the United States shouldn't participate in a robust climate change treaty in which the United States is going to bear greater burdens but help the world as a whole, and especially if that would be a more efficient and effective way to alleviate global poverty and promote global justice. They are going to go ahead. They're not saying that we shouldn't do it. And they say that, and it's definitely better than continued inaction. Remember, they're not trying to say that climate change isn't important. They're not climate deniers. They're not rejecting that the United States should that it would be beneficial if the United States took action on climate change. But the commendation should not be muddied by resort to crude arguments from distributive and corrective justice. What they're arguing is that these aren't based, the reasons why these would be a good idea cannot be based on distributive justice, because this is not necessarily the most effective way to alleviate global poverty and to promote global justice and alleviate global inequality, nor from corrective justice for all the reasons that we've discussed last week and that they discussed in the article. So it's not clear that there's a kind of an obligation from justice for the United States, but it would be more efficient, they argue, that we should separate the demands of global justice from our attempts to mitigate climate change. That we should separate these issues when we kind of analytically. That we should not try to accomplish two goals with one treaty, right? That we're going to be able to get a much more effective and binding climate treaty if we bracket the question of global justice first and make sure that we have universal greenhouse gas emission lower mitigation targets that are enforceable so that everyone is cutting their emissions. And then we need to have a secondary effort to alleviate global inequality and global poverty. And that by separating these two issues, that we can stop getting the kind of normative and political confusion and disputes that we get when we bring these two issues together. Or that's at least Posner and Sunstein's kind of intuition, is that we would be more effective at solving both of these problems by separating them from one another. Now, Parks and Roberts, who you've read, disagree. In the longer book version, they argue that we believe another powerful way to demonstrate solidarity, empathy, kindness, friendship, and loyalty to would-be cooperators could be to show support for the concerns and priorities of developing countries in highly valued areas of international political economy. This may ultimately prove to be more important for the long-term success of global environmental accords than institutional reforms, carbon accounting schemes, or environmental aid. If you want to get developing economies, China, India, Brazil, Russia, to buy into a global climate treaty right at the time when their emissions are kind of overtaking Western Europe and North America, you're going to have to signal to them through serious efforts to lead to, in terms of global economic redistribution, or investment, or financial assistance, or what have you, to show that you are serious about alleviating their economic concerns. Similarly, for least developed countries, if you want them to get on board and not take advantage of cheap and plentiful fossil fuels that are going to be highly polluting, you have to really make serious efforts to alleviate poverty and develop the political and economic infrastructure in these countries in order to get them on board. That you're going to better secure cooperation for a universal greenhouse gas mitigation treaty, Parks and Roberts argue, if by bridging these things together, that showing that the developed wealthy countries take seriously the concerns of the underdeveloped countries. So attending to these present-day development needs and long-term challenges for decarbonization is going to be necessary for an effective climate change treaty. Normally, I would also look at another criticism from Lomborg, who argues that we should focus on prioritizing global challenges and maximizing cost effectiveness, that we should look at all the things wrong in the world and figure out which of these problems, from climate change to malaria to access to clean water to economic development to human rights abuses, and figure out which of these things can we get the most effective return on investment. And this sounds cold and calculating, but he actually makes a fair point that we have scarce resources to devote to fighting all the problems in the world. It would be great if we had infinite resources, but we have limited financial resources, we have limited time and energy, and it doesn't do good to waste those finite resources on things that we can't actually do anything about, so we should prioritize the things that we can be the most effective at fighting. It's not required viewing, but I put a link on Moodle of a TED Talk where he develops this argument with specific reference to climate change. It's a little bit older. He's talking about Kyoto, the Kyoto Treaty, from the late 90s, which we'll talk about later this week. But it's worth checking out if you're interested in another way of posing the same question, that perhaps fighting climate change is not the best way to promote global justice. So that'll be linked to on the Moodle page below this mini lecture. On Wednesday, we're going to read a chapter from Dominic Rosers and Christian Siedel's Climate Justice Introduction on how would we actually implement some of these emissions reduction strategies. What are some actual practical or reforms that we can take to mitigate greenhouse gas emissions? That's going to be the discussion that we'll have on Wednesday. And the discussion post. As a reminder, right, you have to post one 200-word response to any of the discussion threads this week by Friday at midnight. And then you have to reply to one of your peers' posts with a 100-word reply by Sunday at midnight. And you can choose this, if this question is interesting to you, you can choose this one, or you can choose any of the other question threads for this week. So for today, evaluate Posner and Sunstein's argument. Do you find their argument for separating climate change from the questions of global justice persuasive? Why or why not? Could their concerns be integrated into a theory of climate justice? So that is going to be it for today. I hope that the first week of virtual teaching went well, and hopefully that these things will continue to move smoothly. If you have any questions, problems accessing the material, questions about the material, shoot me an email, drop into office hours. Again, during my normal office hours time, there's a link on the Moodle page and you have it on your email. There's a dedicated Blue Jeans room where you can stop in, ask questions. These are drop-in times, so there are like multiple people in the room at any one time. If you need to set up a private meeting with me, shoot me an email and we can set that up if you have things that you wanted to discuss in private. And I can set that up for you. As always, let me know if you have any questions. Stay healthy, stay well, focus on what's important, and I will see you next time. Take care.